Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we introduced metaphysical communication on the Z scale. In this segment we will discuss impulsive communication as well as compulsive and compulsive impulsive communication on the Z scale. In metaphysical communication, the constructive operating range was described as negative 180 characteristics to negative 185 characteristics. According to the standard theory of psychology, at negative 185 characteristics, the capacity for communication changes from metaphysical communication to impulsive communication. As discussed previously, any given cycle of communication on the Z scale has a requirement of containing an impulse, a subtraction and a compression, the information contained in each adding up to a standard, interval ratio unit of information. Once impulsive communication is reached, though, there is a tendency for the process of compression to consistently fail. This absence or failure to compress this information is the basis for the term impulsive communication, as the cycle of communication is no longer expressly based on the compression or the completion of a communication cycle. The advancement from negative 185 to negative 186, from negative 186 to negative 187 and so on become more closely related to the impulse associated with the communication cycle. For that reason, the impulse becomes the focal point of the cycle of communication, the range being referred to as impulsive communication. In impulsive communication, the magnitude of impulse is the focal point of the communication. This cycle can continue from negative 185 to negative 191 characteristics with a total of about 7 communication cycles. When looking a little bit deeper into standard theory, one will find that these processes are more closely equated to about 3.5 processes with 1 complexity. That is somewhat expected as standard theory defines the capacity of communication on the scale of impulse to be about 4.5 cycles. The complexity or unknown in impulsive communication is related to the lack of a true compression of the communication cycle. The idea of complexity as well as the magnitude of impulse can be discussed later. For now, the importance of the range of communication for impulsive communication is the experience of these impulsive, partial cycles at negative 185 to negative 191. At the point of negative 191 cycles, the amount of information being processed forced the loss of true subtraction. This type of impulse-only processing is referred to as compulsive communication. At this point, the cycle of communication is impulse-only. For that reason, the focal point of the cycle is not impulse compared to subtraction but rather the impulse compared to the external factor or stimulation or whichever source that is related to the prompting of the communication. This can be another person, some environmental factor or other situation. That is, the experience of impulse without subtraction and without true compression is the main process in that cycle in compulsive communication. Since there is only impulse, the evaluation of the situation is compared to the magnitude of impulse associated with it. The term compulsive communication refers to the comparison of the communication cycle with the impulse being experienced, especially when that impulse-only cycle is being communicated between individuals or between groups and individuals or between groups. Beyond negative 191 cycles of communication, the capacity for experiencing impulse internally is no longer an option since the amount of negative processing has exceeded the normal amount about 3 times over. In reaching that level of negative processing, the capacity for compression, subtraction and internal impulse have all been maxed out. At negative 197 characteristics and beyond, there is only the capacity for complex communication. This complexity can be denoted by an imaginary number or a complex number. This acts as a placeholder for an unknown magnitude of information related to that communication cycle. This process can also be referenced by thinking of an entire unit plus 1, or as an entire capacity plus some amount of complex processing. That complex amount of processing is completely dependent on the interactions between the individual, the environment, the situation, the previous context of the interaction as well as any other factor being considered within that specific cycle of communication. For these reasons, the communication is nearly always non-standard in a way that requires some amount of subjective interpretation of the complexity being experienced. For that reason, the amount of information can be somewhat difficult to quantify. Beyond that, though, any amount of information that could be used in that cycle of communication can be referenced using a placeholder, i.e. the complex number. In compulsive impulse, there is the max amount of negative activation as well as the complex amount of information being considered in that communication cycle. This experience of complex information is the true limit of constructive communication, as the processing of any additional information would not only be almost completely subjective but is certainly associated with some other non-standard factor such as medication, substances, alcohol, injury, overstimulation, etc. In terms of the normal capacity of the Z scale, the negative limit can be considered to be negative 197 cycles of communication. Even though the idea of complexity and unknown magnitude of any process, whether complex impulse, complex subtraction, or complex compression, is required to explain compulsive impulse, the other applications of this can be discussed at a later time. For now, we will continue to the final constructive version of communication on the Z scale. That type of communication is a factor related to high-energy processing on the scale of impulse, which is referred to as rolling communication. Please join me in the next segment to discuss rolling communication on the Z scale.